The spring Earl Holloway died, the ground was still frozen 2 inches down, and the mortgage payment was due in 11 days. Clayton Holloway stood at the parlor window and watched the men from the Methodist church carry her husband to the wagon that would take him to town. She did not cry, not yet, not in front of Nora, who was 9 years old and standing at her mother's hip with both small hands gripping the fabric of her mother's skirt. The sky that morning was the pale, washed-out color of old linen, and the fields lay flat and gray on every side of the farmhouse, 160 acres of high Kansas prairie that Earl had broken and turned and that now belonged to Clayton and to the bank in nearly equal measure. She watched the wagon until it turned onto the track, and the bare cottonwoods along the fence line swallowed it from sight, and then she went to the kitchen and put water on to boil, and began to think about what she was going to do. If you've ever found yourself settling in with a cup of something warm and a story that takes its time getting where it's going, this is the right place to be. Stay through to the end, because the end is the part that earns everything that comes before it. What Clayton did in the first week of widowhood was not what the county expected. She did not ride to her brother's place in Ellsworth. She did not put the farm up for listing. She sat at Earl's desk 2 evenings running and added the numbers, checked them, added them again, and arrived at a figure she could live with if she was careful. If she reduced the planted acreage to what she and Nora and Pell, the brown mule who had pulled Earl's cultivator for 6 years, could genuinely work, she could not hire, she could not borrow. She could plant 60 acres of corn on the south-facing slopes where the yield was reliable, keep a kitchen garden behind the house, and hold the rest of the land in grass against the day it might be worth something. What she could not yet know, sitting at that desk in the last week of March 1874, was that the south-facing slopes were not the point. What Earl had told her on a cold night 2 winters before when they had sat up late listening to a wind that came from the wrong direction was the point. She had not understood it then. She would not understand it until summer, and even then only partly. The full understanding came on a ridge in September, watching something move across the sky that most people in the county had never seen. Earl had grown up along the Missouri River bottoms in a narrow bottom-ground community where his father had farmed and his father's father had farmed before him, and where locusts came through on no fixed calendar and left behind them a silence that was worse than noise. He had described it to Clayton once, the year after they married, and then again on that late winter night 2 years before he died. He said the sky had a way of moving that was different from weather. He said a cloud that moves against the wind is not a cloud. He said a man on the Missouri bottoms learns to watch the western sky the way another man reads a barometer, not because he has been taught to read it in any school, but because he has stood in a field and watched a crop that took him 4 months to grow disappear in an afternoon. And that kind of watching gets into a man's bones and does not come out. Clayton had listened carefully. She'd always listened carefully to Earl because Earl was not a man who said things for the pleasure of hearing himself talk. He said the only answer was to be ahead of the sky, not behind it. He said a loft full of grain, dried down and sealed against moisture, was worth 10 promises from a growing season that might not finish. He said his father had kept a full loft every year of his life, not because he was greedy or cautious by nature, but because he understood that a year of plenty costs you nothing extra in storage, and a year of ruin costs you everything if your loft is empty. He said the Missouri bottoms had taught his family that lesson twice, and the second time it was taught there were 3 graves instead of 1. Clayton had pressed him then about what exactly to watch for. He said it begins with scouts, a few dozen, then a few hundred, moving ahead of the main body like outriders before an army. They arrive in a direction that makes no sense given the wind. They land briefly and rise again. Most people mistake them for grasshoppers that have always been in the grass, because they look the same as the ones already there. And the difference is only that they are moving with a purpose that the ordinary grasshopper does not have. By the time he died in March of 1874, Clayton had carried that conversation inside her for 2 years. She did not know if the locusts would come that summer, or the next, or in 5 years. She did not know if they would come to her county at all. What she knew was that a loft full of dried corn cost her the labor of hauling it and the cost of drying it down properly, and that an empty loft in a hungry year cost everything. She began in June. Nora understood from the first week that this summer would be different from other summers. There was no full field planting run with Pell dragging the planter behind him across the long south-facing slopes. Her mother planted 60 acres as planned, and when the corn came in, she did not sell the surplus into the elevator at the end of season. She dried it down on frames she had built from scrap lumber in the yard, turning the ears every morning and evening until the kernels rattled loose when she shook them, and then she sacked the dried corn in burlap and had Nora hold the bags while she scooped and tied, and then she led Pell across the yard to the barn, and they hauled the sacks up the loft ladder by rope and block and laid them in rows along the loft floor. Pell had strong opinions about the rope and block arrangement. He expressed them by stopping at inconvenient moments and refusing to move until Clayton scratched the place behind his left ear that he could not reach himself. Nora found this funnier than Clayton did, though Clayton was not entirely without a smile about it. By the end of July, the loft held 130 bushels. By the time the second cutting of the kitchen garden was done and the last ears from the field were dried and sacked, the loft held just under 400 bushels of dried field corn, stacked in rows so orderly that a person standing at the loft door could have counted the sacks without moving. Clayton had built a simple cross-ventilation arrangement at the gable ends, 2 slatted panels that Earl had used for tobacco drying years back in Missouri, and the air that moved through the loft in the evenings kept the stored grain dry enough that she was satisfied. It was the hauling that was visible. That was the part that could not be hidden. Not in a county where a woman's choices were read by her neighbors the way a doctor reads a pulse, quick and sure and sometimes wrong. Pell's comings and goings from the barn, the rope creaking over the block, the neat rows of sacks that could be glimpsed through the loft door on still mornings when Clayton left it open for ventilation. All of it was seen, and seen, and seen again. Heck, Aldermore ran Aldermore Feed and Dry Goods on the main street of the county seat, a 3-day-a-week social institution as much as a business, where men came to buy what they needed and stayed to say what they thought. He was not a cruel man in the private sense. He was a man whose confidence in his own reading of the world had never been seriously tested, and confidence of that kind produces its own particular brand of cruelty without malice, the cruelty of a man who is certain he is right and who enjoys saying so in company. He had ridden past Clayton's farm twice that summer and had seen Pell at the block and the sacks going up. The second time he had ridden past with Clem Prater and a man named Josiah Voss who farmed east of the creek, and Heck had pulled his horse up at the fence line and looked for a moment with an expression that Dorothea Pressman, who was passing in her wagon and saw the whole of it, would later describe as the look of a man who has just thought of something that will make everyone laugh. It was the 3rd week of August when Heck said, at the feed store porch with 8 men present, that Clayton Holloway had spent her summer building herself a grain monument. He said it the way a man says a thing he has been saving up, with the timing of someone who knows he has a good line and has waited for the right audience. He said a widow who had 60 acres of corn she could have sold at the elevator for honest money had instead spent the summer hauling it into a loft where it would sit until the rats got it, or the summer heat cooked it into something no livestock would eat. He said the grief had gotten into her thinking the way a wet spring gets into plaster, and that by next March She would have a loft full of ruined corn and a debt payment she could not meet. The men on that porch found this satisfying in the way that people find satisfying any pronouncement that confirms what they already suspected. Several of them had seen the corn going up too. Clem Prater said he had heard she was reducing her planted acreage on top of it, which was either the most conservative farming he had ever seen or the most confused, and he was not sure which was worse. Josiah Voss said he felt bad for the girl, meaning Nora, and this was accepted as the appropriate note of sympathy that closed the subject. Dorothea Pressman was there. She had stopped at the porch for a pound of salt and had not expected to be standing in the middle of a verdict. She said, carefully, that Clayton Holloway was one of the steadiest thinking women she had known in 15 years as a neighbor, and that a person storing corn in a loft was not noticeably different from a person keeping money in a bank, both of them betting that what they had now would be worth having later. Heck thanked her for the perspective and said he had a bank account, and he was not carting it up a ladder in 100-degree heat. The porch laughed. Dorothea paid for her salt and left. Clayton heard about the grain monument comment within 4 days. News of that kind traveled fast in a county where there was not much else to travel. Nora heard it too, from the Cooper girl at Sunday school, who repeated it with the cheerful cruelty that 9-year-olds bring to borrowed opinions. Clayton watched Nora's face go through something complicated when she told her about it that evening. And then she took Nora to the barn and showed her the loft again, the rows of sacks in the dim light, the air moving through the ventilation panels, the careful arithmetic written in chalk on the beam above the door, 403 bushels, and the date. She told Nora what Earl had told her. She used Earl's words as much as she could remember them, because his words were more precise than her own on this subject. Nora listened the way she had always listened, with her whole attention and both hands still. And she did not ask whether the locusts would really come, because she was her father's daughter, and she understood that the question wasn't whether, but when. The scout swarm came in the second week of September 1874, 12 to 15 days after the main growing season had ended, and the county's fields had given what they were going to give. Clayton saw them from the ridge above the south field on a morning she had gone up to check on a fence section that Pell had leaned on the week before. She was looking west, as she often did from the ridge because the view was long that way, and she saw a movement in the sky that was not weather. It was not large, not yet. A shimmer and drift, perhaps 200 yards wide at the leading edge, moving from the southwest at a pace that had nothing to do with the wind, which was coming, that morning, from the north. She watched it for a long time, long enough to be certain, and then she went back down to the house and wrote the date in the back of the account book and said nothing to anyone in town. There was nothing to say that would not have resulted in more comments on the feed store porch. She spent the fall checking the loft every week. She added a second layer of slatted boarding to the loft floor, where the lowest rows of sacks sat, raising them an inch off the planks to allow air movement beneath. She checked the moisture in the grain by feel and by smell, finding it dry and clean each time, with the faint, sweet, dusty smell of good dried corn that had been properly finished before it was stored. Nora carried water. Nora fed the stock. Nora watched everything her mother did with the focused, undemonstrative attention of a child who has decided, without being asked, to learn. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was unremarkable in most ways. The county saw a cold December and a milder January, and a spring that came a little late, which meant planting ran 2 weeks behind on every farm. Clayton planted her 60 acres of corn again on the south slopes. She did not open the loft. She checked it once a week and added a few sacks from the kitchen garden's late corn and let the rest sit. The summer of 1875 was dry, Clayton noticed it in June, in the way the soil went to powder faster than it should have after rain, and in the way the corn curled its leaves at midday to conserve the moisture in its stalk. She had seen dry summers before. She could not tell from one dry June whether the season was going to turn or whether it was going to be the kind of summer that wrings the green out of everything and leaves fields the color of old straw by August. She kept her water work up, kept the kitchen garden alive by hand, watched the south fields and hoped. The fields managed. By the end of July, the corn was shorter than she would have liked, but it was green and it had ears coming, and Clayton was calculating whether she would have enough to pull the dried-down surplus from the loft for sale or whether she would want to keep it through another winter. She did not have to calculate long. The main swarm arrived on the 28th of July, 1875. Clayton saw it first from the same ridge where she had seen the scouts the previous September, and the scale of the difference between what she had seen then and what she was seeing now was the difference between a single candle and a haystack fire. The western sky, which had been empty and clean and pale blue when she walked up the ridge that morning, was the color of a moving shadow from horizon to a point above her head, and the shadow had edges that shifted and rippled and threw off the light in a way that no cloud of water vapor could have done. The sound reached her before the shadow did, a dry, papery rustling that became, as the leading edge came over the ridge, a noise like 1,000 sacks of grain being poured onto a tin roof all at once. She walked back down to the house at a pace that was faster than her usual. She told Nora to bring Pell into the barn. She pulled the barn door shut. She went to the house and latched the windows and came back out to watch. They covered the south fields in less than an hour. The corn she had grown through the dry summer, the 60 acres of shorter than she wanted but green and coming stalks, was gone by midday. Not eaten down to the ground, though that came, but simply stripped. The leaves and the silk and the forming ears taken off as cleanly as if someone had gone through the field with shears and harvested everything worth having. The bare stalks stood in rows like fence posts when the first pass was done, and then the second wave came through and took those too. The swarm stayed for 4 days. On the first day, the south fields went. On the second day, the pasture grass went thin and the kitchen garden survived only because Clayton covered it with every piece of cloth she owned, weighted at the edges with stones, and even then she lost the bean rows that she had not covered completely. On the third day, the sky was still dark and the sound did not stop, and Nora sat by the loft door with a stick and knocked away the insects that were trying to find their way through the ventilation panels, methodically, without being asked, for 3 hours. On the fourth day, the mass of the swarm moved east, leaving behind a landscape that looked, in the flat morning light, as if someone had burned every field in the county and then swept away the ash. Clayton walked the south field on the morning of the 5th day and counted what was left. There was nothing left that could be called a crop. She walked to the barn and went up the loft ladder and stood among the rows of sacks in the dry, still good-smelling air and counted those too. 403 bushels. The chalk numbers on the beam above the door, written 11 months before. The county's accounting was slower to arrive, because it arrived farm by farm over the following 3 weeks, as men rode into town and had conversations at the feed store that sounded nothing like the conversations of August 1874. Clem Prater had lost his entire corn crop on 90 acres. Josiah Voss had lost corn and winter wheat both, and one of his draft horses had eaten enough of the insects in the first 2 days that it was sick by the end of the week and not right again for a month. Another farmer north of the creek, a quiet man named August Reinhold, had lost his kitchen garden and his corn together, and by the 3rd week of August he had sold 2 of his 4 cattle, because he could not carry them through a winter with no stored grain and no standing forage. The people who came to Clayton's door began with Dorothea. She came on a Sunday morning, the 12th of August, with a jar of plum preserves that she held out at arm's length. When Clayton opened the door, the way a person offers something when they are not certain of the reception. She said she did not know if Clayton had anything extra, and that she did not like to ask, but that her family's stored corn had been in a ground-level pen rather than a loft, and the locusts had found it on the second day, and she was looking at a winter with 3 children and no grain. Clayton took the jar of preserves and set it on the kitchen shelf and told Dorothea to bring her wagon around to the barn door the following morning. She gave Dorothea 25 bushels of dried corn. Word of that traveled faster than the news of the grain monument had, possibly because people in genuine need have better information networks than people looking for something to talk about on a porch. By the end of the 3rd week of August, Clayton had opened the loft 6 more times for 6 different households, measuring out what she could give that would carry each family through to spring without leaving the next family short. She kept the ledger herself, recording each household's name and the bushels given, working backward from the total toward a number she could sustain across 7 households through a 6-month winter. She could do it. It would be tight through February if January was cold, but she could do it. Nora helped with the measuring. She held the scoop and called out the count and wrote the numbers in the ledger in her careful, round hand. And she did not make anything of the fact that some of the people who came to the barn door in those weeks had been the same people who passed the grain monument comment along the county road the previous August. Heck, Aldermore came on the last day of August. He came alone, without Clem Prater or Josiah Voss, which Clayton noticed because he was a man who generally moved in company. He had ridden out from town on a bay horse that looked tired, and he dismounted at the fence and tied the horse and walked to the house and knocked, rather than calling from the yard, which was also different from his usual manner. Clayton opened the door. He stood on the step with his hat in both hands and his eyes moving over the yard and the barn and the loft door in a way that was not the look of a man arriving to buy something. It was the look of a man calculating a debt he was not sure how to pay. He said he had a family on his hands and not much grain, and he had heard she might have some to spare. Clayton looked at him for a moment. Outside, Pell had put his head over the top of the paddock fence and was watching the exchange with the mild, assessing expression he brought to most of the human behavior he observed. She told Heck she had 20 bushels she could give him, and she told him to bring his wagon in the morning. He stood there another moment with his hat in his hands, and then he said it, low and without looking directly at her, in the voice of a man who has rehearsed a thing and still finds it hard. He said, "I called it foolishness." Clayton said, "I know you did." He said nothing for a moment after that, and she let the silence run its full length, not cruelly, only because it was the kind of silence that needed to finish on its own. Then she told him again to bring the wagon in the morning, and she closed the door. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after the latch fell, one hand still on the door, and listened to his boots going back across the yard toward his horse. Outside, Nora was asking Pell in a quiet voice what he thought of all this. Pell's answer wasn't recorded, but it was probably a sound of breath through large nostrils and a slight shifting of weight, which was his standard assessment of situations that did not directly involve him. Heck brought the wagon in the morning and took 20 bushels of dried corn, and he paid for it in cash at the price Clayton named, which was fair and not punitive. Before he left, he stood at the loft door for a moment and looked up at the remaining sacks in their rows. He asked her how she had known. She told him about Earl. She told him about the Missouri river bottoms and the moving sky and the scouts she had seen from the ridge the previous September. She told him about the ventilation panels and the elevated floorboards and the 2-year drying cycle that kept grain sound through a long storage. He listened the way a man listens when he has recently been proved wrong about something important. Carefully, without interruption, with a quality of attention that is not entirely comfortable, but is completely honest. He asked if he could send his man out in the spring to look at how she had built the loft arrangement. She said yes. Over the winter of 1875 into 1876, the 7 households that Clayton's loft sustained were the only ones in the county that did not draw from the relief supplies that the State Agricultural Board sent out by wagon in January, when it became clear that the locust damage was extensive enough to require it. The relief wagons were a mercy, but they arrived with cracked corn that had been stored badly, and some of it was already showing the gray-green color of mold at the edges, and the families who had to use it knew the difference. Aldermore, who had built his business on knowing what his county's farmers needed before they asked, wrote a letter that winter to the county agricultural correspondent, a man named Silas Burke, who kept notes for a small press in the western part of the state. He described Clayton's method in plain, accurate terms: the dried-down corn, the ventilated loft, the elevated floor, the practice of holding one full year's supply past the current season. He attributed the method to Earl Holloway's knowledge of the Missouri river bottoms and to Clayton's application of it, and he used her name, which he had not been in the habit of using with any particular respect the previous August. Silas Burke published the letter in March of 1876. He titled it, in the plain style of agricultural correspondence of that era, a note on corn storage and locust preparedness, and within the year copies of it had been passed across kitchen tables and tacked to feed store walls in 4 counties. Heck, who had by then become the most earnest advocate for the method among the county's farmers, had a habit of explaining it to every man who came to his store counter with a question about winter grain, and his explanations always included the origin of the practice, because he seemed to understand, in that uncomfortable and honest way of his, that the origin was part of the method, that a technique without its provenance was only half a lesson. The spring of 1876 was wet and cool, and the planting ran late again. But when it came in, it came well, and the county recovered in the way that farming country recovers from a single catastrophe when its people are steady and its land is sound. The South Fields on Clayton's 160 acres produced a full crop that year, and she filled the loft again with the surplus, and the chalk numbers on the beam above the loft door were updated in Nora's hand, because Nora was 10 3/4 and had appointed herself the keeper of the loft ledger. What followed was not dramatic in the way that the summer of 1875 had been dramatic. It accumulated, the way understanding accumulates in a community that has been genuinely frightened, slowly and without announcement. Families in the county began keeping fuller lofts. The elevation of the floor and the cross ventilation became standard features of barn construction in the area, described to builders as the Holloway arrangement, or simply as the right way to do it, depending on who was doing the describing. Silas Burke's published letter was cited in 2 subsequent agricultural surveys of the region, one in 1879 and one in 1883, each time in connection with locust damage and preparedness, each time with Clayton's name attached. She did not seek any of this out. She farmed her 160 acres and improved her kitchen garden and kept Pell in good health, which required attention because he was aging in the way that mules age, stubbornly and with growing opinions about what he was and was not willing to do. She paid the mortgage down and had it clear by the spring of 1880, which was not a dramatic moment either, only a morning when she sat at Earl's desk and drew a line through the final figure, and felt a quiet that was different from the other quiets she had known in that house. Nora grew up. She was not a girl who made a fuss about what she had learned, or how she had learned it. She married at 22, a steady-handed man named Caleb Gruber, who farmed 40 miles to the northwest, and she brought with her to that farm not money, which there was not much of, and not land, which was Earl's and would pass to the farm when Clayton was done with it, but a set of practices that she installed in the first season with the confidence of someone who has been watching a thing long enough that it no longer requires explanation. Caleb's neighbors commented on the loft arrangement. Nora explained it. She explained it the same way her mother had explained it to her, with Earl's words where she could remember them, and her own where she could not. She did not call it the Holloway arrangement. She called it what Earl had called it, though he had never given it a name. He had only described it as being ahead of the sky instead of behind it. The phrase found its way into the county. Pell died in the autumn of 1881, at an age that made the county veterinarians say he had been a remarkably sound animal, in the matter-of-fact tone that veterinarians use when they mean to pay a compliment without overstepping the dignity of the subject. Clayton buried him at the corner of the south field, where he had spent so many mornings pulling the cultivator through the young corn, in the shade of the one cottonwood that grew along that fence line, and that Earl had left standing when he broke the field, because he said a field with no shade was a field that had forgotten it was part of something larger. She put a fieldstone at the corner, no name on it. He did not require a name. Anyone who had known him would know the stone. Years later, when people asked Nora about her mother, she would begin almost always with the summer of the corn, the summer when she was 9 years old, and held the burlap bags open while her mother scooped and tied. And Pell stood in the barn aisle waiting for someone to scratch the place behind his left ear. She would describe the loft at full capacity, the rows of sacks in the warm August air, the dust motes moving through the ventilation gap, the chalk numbers on the beam in her mother's hand. She would describe the sound of the swarm arriving, the papery sound, the way it changed the light. She would describe standing at the loft door with a stick for 3 hours on the third day, knocking away the insects, not because her mother had asked her to, but because she understood by then what was in the loft and why it mattered. She would say that her father had given her mother a piece of knowledge instead of money, because the money ran out and the knowledge did not. She would say that the loft was still standing on the south side of the barn, and that she knew because she had driven past it the previous spring, and the ventilation panels at the gable end were newer than the ones her mother had built. But they were in the same position, because the family who had the farm now had been told by the family before them that the position was the point, and that was the whole lesson in one sentence. The summer Nora's own daughter turned 9, they drove out to the farm together on a clear July morning, just to see it. The corn in the county that year was standing high and green, and had been for weeks. The sky above the south-facing slopes was the pale, clean blue of a good growing season, with nothing in it that moved against the wind. Nora's daughter asked why they had stopped at the fence line and were looking at the barn. Nora told her about the loft. She told her about the dried corn and the elevated floor and the ventilation panels, and she told her about Earl, who had stood in his father's ruined field on the Missouri River bottoms as a young man and learned a thing that he had carried west and given to his wife, who had carried it into a catastrophe that would otherwise have been worse than it was. She told her about Pell because no telling of that summer was complete without Pell. She told her about the chalk numbers on the beam and about the way the sacks smelled in the warm air, dry and faintly sweet, like something that had been properly cared for. Her daughter listened with both hands still, in the way that Nora had always listened, and she looked at the barn for a long time. Then she asked if they could go inside and see the loft. They drove around to the barn door, and the farmer who had the place now came out and was introduced to them, and when Nora explained who she was, He nodded in a way that meant he already knew the name, or had known it, and was now placing it where it belonged. He opened the barn, and they went up the ladder to the loft. It was full. Rows of sacks along the boards, the cross-ventilation moving a slow, soft air through the gable panels, the light coming in at a low angle and falling on the grain in a way that made everything in that space look considered, looked after, looked forward to. Nora put her hand on the nearest sack and held it there, feeling the give of the dried corn inside, the slight roughness of the burlap, the coolness of the stored grain through the cloth. Her daughter stood beside her and put her hand on the same sack and held it too. The air moved through the loft the way it had always moved, steady and clean, as if the panels had been placed there with that specific air in mind, which was, in a manner of speaking, exactly what had happened 40-some years before, by a woman who had listened carefully to the right person at the right time, and had not let what she heard get away from her.